This episode begins with a really simple premise. I met my friend Robert LeBlanc when he invited me on his podcast, his show Pints and Pews. And as we had our discussion on that program, it turns out we realized that we're from the same smallish town. We were raised in the exact same hometown. Him as a Catholic and me as an evangelical Christian. And I thought it'd be fun to compare those experiences, talk about Robert growing up Catholic at that time in that place, and contrast that with my experience of Catholics as an evangelical Christian, and now a Catholic convert. That was the premise of this show. What it became was so much more than that. Robert has a really fascinating story to tell about the seeds of Catholicism planted at an early age, the beautiful way that God kind of grows those seeds and unfurls that story, what it means, how it worked in his life, and what lessons we can learn as we raise our own kids Catholic and journey through this Catholic life and the Catholic Church in this day and age and culture. This is, for me, one of my favorite conversations, not just because we're friends, Robert's a great guy, but because this is really a great story of Catholic faith lived out. Growing up Catholic, growing up evangelical with my friend Robert LeBlanc, I think you will love this conversation. Please enjoy. Hey friends, welcome to the show. Thanks for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, and welcome. If you're listening on podcast, make sure you leave a rating or review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. That helps to push the podcast out to new people. And if you're on YouTube, thanks for being there. Please subscribe, hit the bell so you're notified when new videos come out each and every week. And please do leave some comments, interact with me and the show. We love to hear from you. And thanks for watching on YouTube. We're in for a fantastic episode this week, friends. I am joined by Robert LeBlanc. He is a Catholic, husband, father, and a sinner, he says, just trying to make his way to heaven, even though it means a lengthy stopover in purgatory. His travels have taken him through France, Belgium, Germany, and Portugal, among others, but he still feels at home in a smallish town like the one that he and I grew up in. Robert is a Catholic speaker and retreat leader, the author of 2 fantastic books, and the co-host of the fantastic Pints and Pews podcast. Robert, thank you for being here. Welcome to the show. Bienvenue, and hello.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here, Keith. It's an honor. When I look back across the guest list that you have, the illustrious list of guests you've had over the history of the podcast, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm doing here with you. So, and as we were saying before too, because you've been on the Pints and Pews podcast, that's kind of how we first met. Yeah. It's a lot easier when you're the one running the show. Like I'm just a bit of a ball of nerves here today because I'm so used to being on the other side of the microphone, if you want, and the one asking the questions. And now I feel like I'm in the hot seat here.
You are. You're in the hot seat, Robert, but I'm happy to have you in that hot seat. It makes you feel any better. You might be not the most illustrious Scott Hahn of the guests on the show, Robert, but you are, I think, maybe the second French-speaking guest on the show. I can tell you a story just between me and you because no one's watching and listening to this program anyway. So I'll tell you the story. I had Carlo Broussard from Catholic Answers on the show, and I figure Robert, a name like Broussard, he must speak French, have a French background. He's from Louisiana. He's got a really thick, I assumed Louisiana Cajun accent. I don't know. Mm-hmm. So I introduced him in the show, and I said, "Oh, bienvenue, Carlo," and I get this just deadpan stare, and I'm like, "Well, I tried my high school French out, and I guess we're not going there." It was super awkward. So perhaps your illustriousness can be the least making me feel awkwardest French-speaking guest on the show, Robert.
Well, I don't want to make you, you're the host. I don't want to make you feel awkward. Though when you brought out that bienvenue, for the last few weeks, we actually had my friend's daughter visiting from Brussels. So I've been speaking more French than English kind of the last few weeks. When you came out with the bienvenue, it was all I could do to reel it back in, not just to start coming back in French, because it does get to be, you just answer in the language that that comes out at you.
We'll finally reach that French-speaking audience that I've been trying to tap into for years. There you go. We'll do it that way. Robert, I'm happy to have you on the show. This is the idea for this show was bouncing around in my head the last number of months. I was kind of thinking through different angles on this because I really wanted to have you on the show to work through this kind of a conversation and hear about your story and how our journeys intertwine in a bit. And I'll let listeners know, when we first met through you having me graciously enough on your podcast, Pints and Pews, a fantastic podcast, I might add, we discovered that we're from the same smallish hometown. We grew up in the same, a bit of part time wise, but the town hasn't changed all that much in that time, at least. And I thought, how interesting would it be to kind of bookend or have 2 points of view of growing up in that town? Because I mentioned a lot before on this show, part of my journey was encountering these Catholics in this smallish town that I lived in. But the joke that I always give Robert is that those guys at the punk rock shows down at the Legion or at the youth center on Main Street, those are the guys who knew where to get the best dope. Right, with the guys who came in their Catholic uniforms on a Friday after school.
And I could probably name each and every one of them too. Right?
So that for me was my perspective on Catholics growing up and becoming an evangelical Christian early in high school. I saw these guys who, to me, like, how was that any kind of faith? How are these guys Catholic? How are they living out the Christian lifestyle in these different contexts where I saw them? Of course, I've learned a lot since then. I've grown a lot since then in my perspective, and hopefully matured a little bit and understand a bit more about the nuances of faith and being a teenager, and these kinds of things. But I thought, how cool would it be to have you on the show to talk through, that angle of you were I don't know, one of those Catholic guys, Robert, but
those are a few years in purgatory from my high school career.
Well, isn't it for all of us?
But I think this is going to be a very short show then for you because there's not going to be a whole lot more I can add to your perspective if what you saw. In some ways was kind of my experience. I have to say that was probably one of my most favorite podcasting moments was having you on the show. And as we were talking about Pints and Pews, we always have a beer as we talk through the faith. And we both had a beer from one of our favorite breweries, the Old Flame, which is just down the street from me here. And there's another one in our hometown of Newmarket. And as we were talking about that and kind of coming to the realization that we're both from the same town. And that was, I still think about that moment often because it's one of my favorite moments. And like you said too, there's a few years difference between, and I won't say which one of us is older, but I think that those who are watching on YouTube can see who has a little bit more gray in the beard. But I won't let on who that is because I can still live my dreams, right?
Yeah, live those dreams, Robert. Okay, so let's talk a bit about your story, your angle on this whole thing. Tell us a bit about what it was like growing up Catholic in our little small town. And we'll stop along the way. We'll jump into different topics and dissect things and intertwine. But I want to know, tell us a bit about what that was like, that experience.
We had a really good laugh this afternoon because I was sharing with my wife. I said, she is known because I always let everyone in the house know ahead of time when I'm going to be recording these, whether it's the Pints and Pews or coming on a great show like the Cordial Catholic. And I was after lunch talking to my wife. So I didn't really share with you kind of what the subject matter is about for this evening's conversation. I said, he wants to talk about, because she knows that we both grew up in the same town. I says, he wants to know what it was like growing up Catholic in Newmarket. And my wife kind of looked at me and she said, "You grew up Catholic?" I went, "Yeah, no, kind of. Yeah, if you want." Well, I thought you got your sacraments later on in life. I said, well, yeah, first Holy Communion was put off a little bit because we weren't, as a family, going to church. And when I was in that age group for First Holy Communion, but I said, I was baptized as a baby and I got confirmation on time. It was just kind of that one period. And she was like, "Oh, you were baptized as a baby?" I said, "Yeah, no, I was baptized in the same church my parents got married in." And then it kind of dawned on me. I said, probably the only time my parents were in that church was for their wedding and for my baptism. And so my wife says, "So I need to ask again, did you really grow up Catholic?" And it's kind of like, yeah, a little bit hit and miss, I guess, if you really want to look at it. And that's why I'm saying, too, that your perspective of those high school kids, wasn't that far off the mark, even for myself, in a lot of ways. So as I'd been thinking and contemplating this conversation over the last couple of weeks since you sent out the invitation, I've been jotting a lot of notes of different things from my life, of how the faith kind of was intertwined in there. And I can say that, yeah, in some ways I did have a typical cradle Catholic upbringing, that kind of from about the age of 9 on, that there were certain parts of the faith that were kind of, taken for granted. Like, we're going to church on Sunday. But that was kind of about it. Like, there's church on Sunday, but after that, there wasn't a whole lot. So that's where I say it wasn't all that typical either. Like, if you're looking for the story of the kid that, grew up, on his knees praying the rosary every night after dinner, no, that wasn't my household at all. And a lot of that stems, like all of our faith journeys, they start with our parents. And so my own dad was raised Roman Catholic, French Canadian in Ottawa. But in a lot of ways, I would say, for him, especially in his adult life, barely Catholic. Like, for a while, when my sister and I were younger, yes, it was Mass on Sundays. But then even as we got into high school and teenage years, that kind of fell off the wayside. All right. And my mom grew up in the Salvation Army. And even outside of Salvation Army, she shared that she, some Sundays would go to the Anglican church, some Sundays to the Methodist church, some Sundays was back at the Salvation Army. So the Christian faith was there, but there wasn't a huge foundation. The foundation wasn't very strong, especially when it came to the Catholic faith. My mom was actually just sharing, she was over the last few days, and she said the first time she met her in-laws, so my grandmama and grandpapa, my parents were engaged, and my dad took her to Ottawa to meet his parents. And the next morning, my mom said, "So how did it go?" And my dad said, "Well, my mom only had 2 questions at the end of the night. Does she speak French, and is she Catholic?" Right? And it was no on both accounts. So the faith wasn't a huge part of my parents' relationship, aside from getting, yes, married in the church and having their children baptized in the church. But really, my very first memory of church is the United Church in Newmarket. And I'm sure you can picture the big yellow brick church on Main Street at the top of the hill in Newmarket. And that was my first experience of church, was going there. Right? And I can remember sitting up in the balcony wondering, well, how come I can't have the crouton and the grape juice? Right? And then from that, the Sunday school and in the gym, and running around the gym, and there was maybe a little bit of Christian lesson going on. I was 3. I really can't remember all of the details of that, but that really was my first experience of church. Now, my first experience of Catholicism was through my grandmama and my dad's mom in Ottawa, and we would go to visit 2 or 3 times a year. And it's actually kind of funny. We would drive from Newmarket to Ottawa, and we would go right through Port Perry, which is where I live now. So, like, all my life, 2 or 3 times blowing through this little town, and now that's where I am. And so my first experience of Catholicism, and it's not that we would go to Mass as such while we were there. She would go to Mass. We would all still hang out in the apartment. but just the Catholic iconography that was in her apartment. And two things really stand out from my childhood there. Was that in her bedroom, so we would get Grandmama's bedroom to sleep in. I guess she was then on the sofa or something. And at the foot of her bed on the dresser, watching over the bed, was a 3-foot statue of Saint Anne. As in French Canada, Saint Anne is kind of the patron saint, or one of the patronesses of Catholic Quebec, of French Canadian Catholicism. And there's a strong devotion to Saint Anne. And so I always remember this statue that was watching over us while we sleep. That same statue now, 50 some odd years later, I guess now I'm giving away which one of us is the elder statesman here, is now in our dining room.
Oh, wow.
Right? So it eventually found its way into our home, and she watches over us while we eat. And I always say that, our family patron saints have a habit of picking us. So there was Saint Anne that I grew up with, but we found out a few years ago, we went 7 years ago back to Portugal, to the Azores, which is where my in-laws are from. And my father-in-law's home parish is Santa Ana, Saint Anne. And we were there for the feast of Saint Anne. Oh, wow. And if you want to go see a beautiful Catholic culture and doing a saint's feast day, Portugal is the place to do it, because the floral carpets and the mass and the procession and the bands playing. And this is on a tiny little island in the middle of nowhere, right? So it's so Saint Anne was always a big part of my life growing up. And then the other part that I always remember from my grandmama's apartment is she had on the wall this picture painting. And this was a painting of Mary holding the Christ child, kind of overlooking a valley. And on a far hill on the other side of the valley, there are 3 crosses on the top of the hill. And so Mary's holding the Christ child and gazing across to Golgotha. And even as a young child, I was just floored by the imagery of this painting. And again, through the grace of God, this painting is now in our bedroom, right? And I mean, there's other pieces. I'm sitting here and I can look above. There's a crucifix that would light up with a picture of Jesus and Mary that was in her dining room. So a lot of these things have kind of come down to myself. And my dad, even though he wasn't practicing his faith at all, especially in his last 25 years of life, when he had his mom's Pieta on his dresser, like he had these little tokens of his faith. So this was really my first experience with Catholicism. And I always remember my mom too sharing, we would go to visit in Ottawa and she'd be helping doing dishes in the kitchen. She said she would just hold her head still and roll her eyes around just to see how many pictures of Jesus she could actually see, even there in the kitchen. And so kind of this was the start of my Catholic faith, or my first introduction to things that are Catholic. But again, still, we weren't going to Mass as a family. There wasn't, the Catholic faith wasn't a part of our life at this point. And here I'm saying, like, I'm 7, 8 years old at this point in time.
Yeah.
And so then it's at about this time, through my dad's work in business, that we ended up going to Montreal as a family for a weekend, 2-3 days. Again, I'm 8 years old. I don't really remember all of the details and how long and where or why. But we ended up at the Oratoire Saint-Joseph, at the St. Joseph's Oratory there on the mountain in Montreal. And I really think that Saint Brother Andre played a role in pushing myself and pushing my family into the faith and really deepening that. Now, I mentioned just a little while ago that we did have my friend's daughter visiting us from Belgium, And so, 2 weeks you hit all of the highlights. So in 2 weeks, I think we did about 2,500 kilometers on the car. Toronto a couple of times, Niagara Falls, and then Ottawa and to Montreal. And we went to the oratoire. We went to the oratory. And I remember saying to this young lady as we were going into the oratory, I said to her, "You're really going to see here where pilgrimage and tourism collide." All right. And I just want to share this brief little story, and I'll come back to how St. Brother Andre helped bring us into the faith. So not just this time, but also the time before about 10 years ago, we were in Montreal again to the oratory. And so 10 years ago, we're in the crypt in the oratory, and we go to St. Brother Andre's tomb. And with the notion that, we want to pray at the saint's tomb. And there's some guy leaning with his elbow on the tomb and his cup of Tim Hortons coffee, having a little chat. And so we just kind of kept going through, because there's like a little circular walkway. So we just kind of kept going. And then I got it. That's not right. That's not right. Yeah. So I just keep going the circle. I go back in. He's still sitting there leaning on the tomb with his cup of coffee, chatting about whatever. Basta. So get down on my knees and start praying. So he left after a couple minutes. I think he kind of got the hint. But it's kind of this world where, like I say, pilgrimage and tourism collide. So when we were there a couple weeks ago, when we got into the crypt and to St. Brother Andre's tomb, it was just my wife and I. All right. So we get down on our knees and touching the tomb and praying, and it moved to tears. Anytime I've prayed at a saint's tomb, it's just moved to tears for what this person has done for the kingdom, and moved to tears. And again, I can't remember how long was there. I finished my prayers. I stand up. My wife is still kneeling there praying, and there was a German tour group coming through, and you could hear them coming because the tour leader had a microphone he was talking into in German, and they all had little earpieces that they were listening to the tour. And as he came around the corner, and all of a sudden he saw my wife there, you could hear the volume just drop. And they kept going, and everyone's coming through, and you could tell that they felt kind of awkward as well. That they realized that there is something holy here. Yeah. And it is a holy place. And my 8-year-old self also kind of realized that it was a holy place. All right, so go back again. I won't say how many. I can't do the math that quick. So my 8-year-old self is there, and there's all of the candles. Have you ever been in the crypt at the West Central?
Never.
Oh, so that's your holiday next summer. You're going on pilgrimage because and hopefully by then all the construction's done, because the whole front's all ripped up now. But you go in the crypt, and I'd say it's about 2 stories high, and so they've got all the candles to light candles for prayers, and they have all of these crutches that are over 100 years old from the healings that happen there. So it really is impressive that you see this faith there, and St. Brother Andre's there, and then they have in a separate vault, his heart has been put into a special casket, and it left a huge impression on this 8-year-old child, to the point where my mom caught me at the drinking fountain blessing myself. And who knows if it was even the proper sign of the cross, because at that point there had been 0 catechesis. But I just knew that when you're in a holy place, you splash water on yourself and you're all good with God. And my mom's thought at that point was, we got to get this kid to church. Right, we got to get him in there. So that was kind of the push to get us going back to the Catholic Church. Some of my parents' friends were also going to the Catholic Church, so that made it easier. And that brought about actually my mom's own conversion. Right, so I was, I think, 9 years old, and my mom came into full communion with the Catholic Church. And again, because I think the Salvation Army, their christening is different from our baptism, so she even had to be baptized.
Oh, wow.
So at the Easter Vigil, there was her baptism First Communion and confirmation all together. And I can still, again, it's over 40 years ago, so memory's a little bit hazy, but can still remember this.
It must be interesting for one thing, the seriousness of her faith, like that takes some seriousness of faith to come into, not for a marriage or for a funeral or for whatever, but to become Catholic because you're believing that that's true and following that desire. And then for you as a kid to see that must be a really interesting experience, to experience that faith blossoming in your parent at that age, right? That's pretty interesting. What did that do for you in your faith?
I really don't know how intuitive I was to that. Like I saw what was going on. We had started going to church, and there was for me an attraction to the faith. I think it was just cool to see Mom going through that. Mm-hmm. I don't remember her from the RCIA program or anything like that. And again, at 9 years old, and a little bit of our own family personality, it was a reason to have a good party as well, right? So again, that notion of the strength of the faith and that being drawn into a deeper theological reality wasn't necessarily there. And I think in some ways that's also very typical of my generation, in that we were kind of the first or the second generation to come out of the Second Vatican Council, and there wasn't as much of the catechesis that's going on, right? And so at that time we did start going to Mass, and I remember that Easter Vigil well, not just because my mom was up in the sanctuary receiving her sacraments, but it was really my first experience of all of the smells and bells, and being drawn in by the beauty of the liturgy, even though I was probably gagging on the incense and kind of
yeah, been there.
Go to kind of waving it away. But being pulled in by the smells and bells of that all. And then also too wanting to receive the bread. I mean, it goes right back to my first experience at the United Church, wanting the crouton.
Yeah. And
wanting to receive the Eucharist. So I had to catch up a little bit, because at this point I'm 9 years old, and it's a couple of years since my peers have all received their first Holy Communion. So I'm having to go to the Sunday school lessons, and I'm about 6 to 8 inches taller than everyone else in the class, and having to play catch-up catechesis. And to be quite honest, the only thing I remember from those Sunday school classes preparing me for First Holy Communion, there was some activity about, imagining what is it like going on in heaven. And I saw it at that time as being a war between good and evil. And again, looking back time-wise, Star Wars or Empire Strike Back was really big in the theater then. So I had this big picture of Star Wars and the X-Wing fighter, and chasing down Satan in his TIE fighter. And
that's great.
You laugh. This is going to get better after. So we'll come back to the Star Wars bit in a little bit. But that was kind of my view. And that was my catechesis, getting ready for First Holy Communion. And I've always maintained kind of like my generation was kind of the uncatechized generation. And so you wonder why my generation of 50-somethings are not necessarily in the pews. Is because we were never drawn in. We were never drawn in. We were never taught the beauty. We were never shown the beauty, right? But it was at this age, at 9, I always like to say I started my life within the Catholic bubble. Right? Because not only did we start going to church on a more frequent basis, pretty much weekly, unless we had to go skiing or go here or go there. But and again, that just gives you a feel for the typical atypical Catholic upbringing in our small town. Serving on the altar. So a lot of my friends were fellow altar servers. One of the guys I met as an altar server when I was 9 was the best man at our wedding, and we still get together maybe once a year or so. And all of my friends I had at school, most of them you would see at Mass on Sunday. Most, not all, and I would say more than you would see now. All right, if you're going to a Catholic school now, and you're going to Mass, you're maybe in the 5%, 10% at most. And so that really was like living in a bubble, but also was, again, still that introduction to the Catholic basics. And I remember one of my first days in a Catholic school, and this was grade 4, so 9 years old, and I came in halfway through the year. And so, Robert, will you lead the class in saying the Hail Mary? And there was just this dead silence. No clue. I know who Mary is, but why do we have to hail her like this? There was just no there was no clue.
Yeah.
And there was really no one at home to teach either. My dad probably could have, but it wasn't necessarily on his radar. And for my mom, this was all new. As much as she was on fire for the faith, as you would know most new converts are, that their first little while, there really wasn't any catechesis going on at home and even at school. So within the Catholic school, I don't really remember there being Mass at school. I'm sure there was. I'm not going to say there wasn't. I'm going to say if there was, it wasn't the highlight of my time at school. Religion class, I really don't recall. I remember the priest coming in to visit. We had one guy who was a seminarian in the parish, and then a transitional deacon, and then associate pastor. So, and he actually became a fairly good friend for a while. But yeah, it was kind of like going to a public school, except that there was a cross on the wall.
Yeah.
Right. One of the funny things, though, too, at this time, because starting to serve on the altar, and because I was involved at church, I was almost seen as the religious education source for my friends. Well, yeah, you're the altar server, so you have to be behaving this way. And how come you're not if you're an altar server, how come you're doing this or that? So it comes back to your notion of these guys from the Catholic high school, and they're not really showing what it means to be a Catholic. So I would get that a lot, but also, okay, you're an altar server, so you have to know what's going on. And I have distinct memories of being at a birthday party, and again, no more than 10. So we were 9, 10, 11 years old. These little dudes at a sleepover birthday party, and I don't know whose bright idea it was to bring out the Ouija board, right? And my buddy's mom, who would also be at Mass with, would be sitting beside their family in the pew at Mass on Sunday. She's there. Oh, yeah, bring out the Ouija board. Okay, but before we do the Ouija board, you're the altar server. You have to give each of us a blessing to protect us while we do this.
Of course.
Okay, and did my best father impression and waved my hand over everyone, and probably went back to the water fountain to get some of that magical water out of the water fountain to sprinkle on everybody. But yeah, that was kind of where we were at for catechesis. And I have to say, the other added bonus of being an altar server when you're in elementary school is getting out of class to go serve funerals. Right. And I look back now, and none of the stuff would happen in the church today. But, the priest would come pick us up, would get in the back seat of his car, probably no seatbelts back then either. All right. Head over to the church and serve the funeral mass, and stop at the corner store on the way back to get a chocolate bar or gum, and I'll be back at the school and kind of go, oh yeah, we were out all morning. So that's kind of the lack of catechesis, I guess. And like I said, I don't know what you were looking for what it was like growing up Catholic. And it was like growing up anyone else in town up to this point.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So Was there a difference up into high school? Like for you, because so for me, my experience in high school, for me, I was raised, interestingly enough, my first experience of church also is in United Church, the United Church in Sharon, just outside of Newmarket.
Okay.
I think my mom's friends went there, and for some reason we began going there a couple times, a handful of times, and I remember my favorite communion story is going up, and I got to go up because we were nominally, I guess, Protestant. So our first real church experience, though, and I remember I went up and you had to tear the bread off this loaf, like tear a piece of bread off this loaf. Mm-hmm. And then I think like dip it in the wine, and then you ate it. And I remember as a kid going up there, and I tore a piece off, and it was just way too big. It was this giant, like as a kid, like it was as big as my fist, right? And I thought, oh my gosh, what do I do with this? Do I hide it? Look over here. Do I put it in the plant here? Like I can't eat this. It's just too big. And I somehow managed to put it in the wine and got it in my mouth. But then the taste of the wine was just this bitter, like, so my mouth is stuffed with this bread, and this wine's like, oh, what's going on here in my mouth? Like, that's my lasting memory of my first real church experience. And then the bizarre thing with that too, Robert, is that I guess we were signed up at that church in some form or fashion, because I got a call, I don't know, maybe 10 years later or so for confirmation. And I remember my mom calling, the phone rings back in the day, the house phone, right?
Yeah,
rings.
Attached to the wall.
My mom answers and goes and says, hey, the phone's for you. It's the priest at the United Church, or the pastor at the United Church, wants to know if you want to get confirmed. And it stands out to me as one of the first times my parents kind of threw me under the bus. Because I go, well, Mom, what's confirmation? And she goes, I don't know what confirmation is. You talk to him. She's calling for you. And so we hadn't been there in, I don't know, 8-10 years or something. I don't know what age confirmation is in the United Church, but it was a number of years since we'd been there. And he had me on a list, and I was at that right age to start calling people on that Rolodex, right? So he calls me, and I said, well, no, I don't really want that. Like, I don't believe in that. Sorry. And it was a really strange experience, but up to that time for us, like, religion wasn't really a thing. We went for a bit to that church and then kind of not at all for a while. And so for me, high school was formative, right? I can remember, my story began sitting around a campfire at the end of grade 9. I was a band nerd, so we all these band kids, and so this was an end of the year party, but party in very loose sense. We were very nerdy kids. We didn't really party in the sense that high school kids probably were partying elsewhere that night.
Especially from your high school. And I'm not going to name names there either, but let's just say your high school had a bit of a reputation,
as it turns out. And see, I didn't even know those people who were doing those partying, but as it happens, that was my first exposure to faith, to thinking outside of myself, because there was this guy that was at this campfire who was a Wiccan of all things, who began really talking about what it meant to believe, and the world is bigger than just you and I, and there's a cosmic force at work, and a language I hadn't even thought about before, and I began to, in that moment, kind of come out of my shell of selfish, kid, self-focused, being a kid, being a young teenager, right? And began to think about outside of the box, outside of, well, maybe there's more to this world than just me and my own interests, and that was the gateway drug to Christianity for me. And I became Christian, evangelical that summer. Bought my Bible from the Treasure House, which is a fantastic, no longer existing, Christian supply. Mm-hmm. I think it was a Christian. What do they call that? Christian supply or something. It was a really interesting way they labeled that, but.
It's where you go to get your croutons and grape juice.
Yeah, you do. Yeah. And tucked away in the back, there were rosaries, as it turns out. I learned later in life. But, that was my high school experience, was for me really an awakening of my faith. And that's when I saw these guys and girls who were supposedly Catholic, in the context I saw them. Now, mind you, I didn't know any Catholics because those guys went to Catholic school down the street. So I wouldn't have known them in a social setting apart from the guys going to these punk rock shows. So I didn't know the altar servers, right? Who probably weren't doing all that much or this much drinking on a Friday night. But for me, high school was an awakening of my faith. So I want to know for you, like, what was that experience? Because here you are, this semi uncatechized Catholic kid, altar server. I mean, what was that like for you? Kind of becoming your own person.
Yeah, and again, coming back, you say you wouldn't really have known those kids, and if we had grown up at the same time, we probably wouldn't have known each other either,
Yeah.
right? Because again, I call it that Catholic bubble.
Yeah.
That you go to a Catholic school, all your friends are Catholic, and you go to the same church. It's not like the people are going to different churches. You're all within that bubble. And I have to say that move from elementary school to high school, and I've heard your story so many times, and your listeners have heard your story, and that great awakening, and that you say the gateway drug into Christianity in your evangelical high school years. Not so much that, yes, we had a distinct religion class. And actually back in the day, because I was the first, maybe the second year of full funding of Catholic education right through grade 13 at the time. Did you ever have grade 13 OAC?
We called it OAC by my time. But
okay, I was number one OAC first year, so we were kind of, we called ourselves grade 13s, but we really weren't. But that's how old.
I was the last year. I was the last year, Robert.
Okay, so
aren't we bookends? Yeah,
bookends on that. So when I first started going to the Catholic high school in town, the religion class, you got half a semester of religion class and half a semester of phys ed for grades 9 and 10. So you didn't have a full religion class. And as much as it was mandated to take religion every year, so then grade 11, the world religions, and then grade 12, ethic, grade 13, I just neglected to sign up for religion, and nobody seemed to raise an eyebrow over it. So even though it was a mandatory credit, and so when I step into my grade 9 religion class, and some of your listeners, especially your listeners in the Toronto area, probably know of Father Yake. And Father Yake was my religion teacher, but he's also taught some courses at the seminary here. And I think the year I entered grade 9, he published a book about Star Wars and the Bible. Right? So it always comes back to Star Wars. And so grade 9 religion class was watching Star Wars. And when you come in the next day, of course, nobody remembers where we left off. So you have to kind of start near the beginning again. So that was religion class, was Star Wars. And again, I don't remember it had to have happened that there were masses and liturgies. And whenever we got together for an assembly, yes, prayer was part of what went on. But outside of the cross on the wall over top of the classroom door, the faith really didn't permeate life all that much. And I was chuckling. You mentioned you were a band nerd, right? And so was I. Somewhere around there, I think grade 9 or grade 10, I actually even won the Instrumental Music Award, which befuddles many of the people I know because musical talent does not reside here at all. I mean, I only ever played brass instruments because you only had to remember what to do with 3 fingers. After the 3 fingers on the brass instrument, forget it, I'm lost. But again, all of my friends that were in the band, right? Altar servers, my buddy on trombone, who ended up being my best man, altar server with, the guy that played the saxophone, the guy that played the baritone, myself, played the French horn because, with a name like Robert LeBlanc, growing up in an English-speaking, anything that says French on it, you gravitate to. So yeah, we were the band nerds, and we would hang out. Some of them ended up going to what was called Incorporated, or a core retreat. And I maybe should have pushed harder to be involved in that, but there wasn't really an outside faith movement within my life. And I think grades 9 and 10 would have been the time to pull me in. I was part of the youth group and the youth group executive at the parish, but it was more for social gatherings, planning, that we would have fundraiser dance, or we'd go a ski day or to the Blue Jays game. And that was more what the youth group was about in the church than any kind of catechesis. I remember being chastised the one time at the youth group meeting for having my heavy metal hit magazine out, right? And we're, me and my buddy are looking at the pictures, and that, put that away because we need to talk about the ski trip. Right? So I think a lot of it is, some missed opportunities. I'm just looking at my notes, things I said. I made all these notes, things I wanted to bring up. Like even in the high school, in the arts department, and they had their big showcase, and there was someone had done a nice portrait of St. John Paul II. At the time was Pope John Paul II, even before he was old, right? He'd only been Pope for maybe 5 years, not even 10 years at that point. And there was a cigarette taped up to his lips, right? Like that was the catechesis going on in our Catholic high school. And it's not to be lit, because there was a lot of great people in there. And I think a lot of people of faith. And I think a lot of seeds were planted along the way, right? Whether it was through elementary school or high school, because now through social media, I'll see pictures of so-and-so and so-and-so, and they're, oh, this is who I met at Mass recently, or this part of it, and I'm thinking, wow, I didn't realize there was any faith, in that person's life. But I think as much as I'm deriding my upbringing, and kind of coming back to my wife's question right at the beginning, did you really grow up Catholic? I think there's that typical notion that the faith was always there in the background. It was always part of our lives, as much as it was taken for granted. And then as kind of went out of those formative years at about the age of 15, 16, and into the more rebellious years, right, it became even less and less. And again, I think because it was never a huge part of my parents' life, it was never part of our family life. So it was very easy to walk away from the faith at that time. And a typical university experience, liberal arts degree. Again, I mentioned I had my friend's daughter over from Brussels. I went for a year to study in Brussels, in Belgium. And I went to the Université Libre de Bruxelles, so the Free University of Brussels, which was created because it was to go in competition, I guess, if you will, with the Université Catholique de Louvain. So the Free University was created to counterbalance the Catholic University. And of course, I ended up at the Free University. Not that it mattered much at university again. And I can't speak to what was going on in the Catholic University. So did that, finish my degree, teacher's college, and I get to the point where I need a pastoral reference to get a job with the Catholic School Board. And so I started going back to Mass just so that maybe the priest will recognize who I am. And my buddy, who I'd served on the altar with at the same parish 20 years before, not 20, maybe 15 years before, he was the music director at that time. So I had him try to introduce me a couple of times. So I get to the priest's office to fill out this pastoral reference, and he looks at me, he's like, "Who are you?" And I'm thinking, yeah, this isn't going to go well. But it was also the beginning of a long and winding road back. And if those seeds had not have been planted all the way along, right from my baptism through even the United Church, but my grandmama's apartment, St. Brother Andre, at least being within that Catholic bubble, in that it was kind of in the background, was able to bring me back to the point where, through my wife's witness to the faith, and my wife living a very integral Catholic faith, was able to bring me back to the point where 1 year for summer vacation, we were in Lourdes and Fatima, and the experiences in both of those places really then set my heart on fire. But in comparison, again, like I said, I've heard your story, and the the Bible classes and the scripture study and the camps and the retreats, and no, it wasn't there. It was not part of my experience growing up. Did it exist with some? Maybe. But as a typical Catholic teenager in a typical North American small town, it was not a huge part of who we were growing up at all.
And that seems, like you say, typical, and does seem typical in terms of catechesis at that time, right? That it just wasn't something that, I mean, I just know from looking back and reading, and the people that I knew in my time, in those Catholic circles, that the catechesis wasn't a really important thing, right? Your youth group was about. I love that you're putting the magazine away. A youth group talk about the ski trip, not to do like liturgy or have a little time with the ski trip.
It was a social
put that away.
group.
The ski trip's more important. I thought it was going to be the liturgy was more important, or this prayer is more important, but no, it's the ski trip. And that's interesting. That seems like such a thing at that time, right? Not that it's not changed or that it's changed, but it seems to be like kind of how when I think about that time in the history of the church and how the church was explaining itself and witnessing and preparing youth to go out and live the Catholic life, that seems like what I imagine. Now you had an experience, and through your wife and these experiences and those seeds that I think that's so beautiful, how those were planted like that. You now, as far as I know, Robert, live in the Catholic life. I think fully immersed, or doing a good job pretending, at least, like those guys in high school.
Doing the best I can, but some days I wonder. Well, I think that's all all of us that are trying to live the life. We're our own worst critics in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. So, what I wonder is the ramification of that kind of catechesis at that time. Right, that Catholic upbringing, that Catholic education, that maybe, right, putting on the Star Wars instead of doing some kind of serious talk about religion. What do you think is the impact of that? I mean, you mentioned you've seen some peers from that time who obviously seeds were planted because they're practicing Catholics, but I feel like I know the stories of so many people who at that time, right, were raised Catholic and then never again. Like my experience of Catholics from that time period as evangelical later in my 20s was meeting them at my evangelical church, and they'd go, oh yeah, we used to be Catholic, but now we know Jesus and we're evangelical and we're at this church now. And then they'd go on to talk about all these Catholic things that were really misnomers and misunderstandings about the faith, but they picked up those notions in high school as a Catholic. They left that version of the Catholic faith for the authenticity of the evangelical faith, but really what they were leaving wasn't really the Catholic faith, and what they're sharing now and criticizing wasn't the Catholic faith, but that's what they understood and were taught to be as the Catholic faith, right? So I mean, what is your perspective on those ramifications for people who went through what you went through?
I think you've hit the nail right on the head, right? 100%. That it was really missed opportunities.
Yeah,
I think is maybe the best way I could describe it. This missed opportunity to catechize a whole generation. And because we've missed that generation, you're starting to see the fallout of that. I was reading a book at one point. Actually, it was on the French language in Canada. And it says, the French immersion program is a great program. And I'll say that as well. Not that I'm a product of the French immersion program. I didn't speak French until I was 16 and then spent time overseas. But I teach in the French immersion program. And I think it offers great opportunities. But it says one of the biggest problems of the French immersion program is that our students are learning the mistakes from their teachers because we're not Francophones. All right. And I get that because I know I'm constantly making errors. And my students will then pick up on that. And I think that's kind of almost what we can see with this misgeneration of Catholic catechesis is that our generation is now teaching that the half truths or the half lessons that we kind of gleaned here and there, and a lot of it maybe even coming from secular media as well, that really doesn't give complete justice to our Catholic faith. And there's that need to start reclaiming, and we're seeing that more and more. Podcasts like the Cordial Catholic that is constantly out there trying to right the wrong. Like you say, like a lot of people, and I can't remember the wording exact that you use. You would know better than I, even though I listen to it all the time. But just trying to get what the real story is on Catholic teachings, right? And so there's yourself, and Scott Hahn does a great job at that. Bishop Barron, the Pints and Pews podcast. Again, we do our best, but we're probably, making more mistakes than anything as we go along. But I think you're starting to see a bit of a shift. And when you think of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, at one point he said that, kind of for the church to become stronger, it needs to become smaller. Yeah, and you're going to see a higher concentration, and that smaller pocket of church is going to have a stronger catechesis. And then once that foundation has been built again, we'll be able to start going back out and sharing that.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring up. And I think of that quote often. I do. And where we live now, we just moved to Sarnia, Ontario here. Our diocese just merged all the parishes in Sarnia into a family of parishes. Mm-hmm. And I think, I think on one hand, it's terrible. That means there's not enough Catholics to populate these churches. On the other hand, I think of that quote, right? They're okay. This is actually an okay thing, because this means that the church is going to be smaller, but more authentically Catholic, right? Those people that were nominally there or culturally there are leaving, have left, but the core of us is being built up and more concentrated, and then, like you say, can then go out and call those people back in, right? Do the work of calling back in. I wonder, we could go on for a long time, Robert, but I want to ask you one more question, maybe, and close this off.
I know it's getting after my bedtime, so I don't want to be going to. That's old guys need to get our sleep.
Keep you up too long.
I missed my afternoon nap today. So.
I understand. I know what I miss mine too with three small kids. Look, I wonder. I'm thinking of you and I today, growing up in that smallish town, and I wonder the experience of say me and you now, right? The evangelical kid going to Cedarview Community Church, like the Catholic guy at Sacred Heart. I won't name my high school because you're just going to tease me. But I wonder what that experience is like now. Is there hope? Is there hope that those kids these days would have a better footing in their faith to be able to articulate what their faith is all about? And if they were to meet, would I don't know, have a different experience than me as an evangelical, having these kind of misnomers about Catholics and seeing kind of the worst of the Catholics. Is there hope to think that, and I think you've already maybe alluded to this, is there hope to think that this generation and generations to come will be better catechized? Like, is there things we have to do, gaps we have to fill, areas we have to push out into harder to make sure that we're passing on this faith? I mean, we have kids. I have very small kids. I'm thinking, is there hope that they'll find a world they can fit into as Catholics?
Well, there's always hope. Always hope. Like, that's our faith is based on hope. Yeah. But would they, like, if you and I were to have met, saying that we were the same age as high school students today, one as an evangelical and the other as a Catholic, would the evangelical be able to discuss his faith? 100%. what he, as a teenager, and you could answer that better, as an evangelical teenager, can you, as much as you can articulate what your faith is, do you have a complete grasp of what it is? And that's just calling into notion the cognitive abilities of a 15-year-old.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with the catechesis. On the Catholic side of that, my answer would be maybe or depends, right? Both kind of meaning the same thing. It depends on the foundation that student or that adolescent has had growing up. And the parents are the first educators of their children in the faith. And so it depends on what the faith life of the parents is. And as much as my own son is at 18 questioning things rather rigorously now, I know those seeds have been planted.
Yeah.
And he'll always say, well, Dad, at 18 you weren't going to church. It's like, fair enough. And I know I always came back, right? So there's that hope there. But I also know that if someone were to ask him about why Catholics do certain things or what they believe, he'd be able to formulate some kind of answer.
Yeah.
Right. But there are others that have grown up in the Catholic system that might not be able to do that, just because the adults that they have encountered are from that uncatechized generation. Right. And that's really the biggest missed opportunity of having an uncatechized generation, is that the generations that come after don't really even have anyone to go to be catechized, or it's not floating in the background of their lives like it was floating in the background of my life, like on my grandma, right? So there was always that notion that was kind of there, where that doesn't exist as much, if at all, anymore in many homes. And so are the adolescents of this generation able to articulate their Catholic faith? Some yes, some no. It just depends on the adults that they've come into contact with. But if the seed has been planted, and the seed is planted at baptism.
Yeah.
And a great line I was reading from a book today on Fatima, it's our vocation to get to heaven, right? And our baptism begins that process. And so there's always this yearning within our humanness to be completed. And we just celebrated the feast of St. Augustine, and our hearts are restless and they won't rest until they rest in you. Sometimes it just takes a little while to figure out who that you is. All right. And so our hope has to be that they will eventually come around. Right.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic. That's very well said, Robert. Gives me goosebumps. And you're right, we can't discount the graces of baptism, right? That's a very real thing. And those prayers, I mean, I think I learned, I thought back on this recently. My mom's parents were a bit of a difficult marriage and upbringing, and her grandparents did a lot of, her mom's parents did a lot of the raising of her and helping out. And I always knew them as Jehovah's Witnesses. Right. And that's how I knew them. And we were kind of a bit estranged from them in that respect, because it was kind of a weird thing. They didn't do birthdays or Christmas, and we didn't kind of talk about that very much. But I remember when I was in high school, after I became an evangelical Christian, I'd found in my, I don't know how I came upon it, but in my parents' bedroom somewhere in a bureau or something, looking for something, an old Bible and a rosary. And I kind of went, well, whose are these? This is weird. Like, why am I finding this here? And it turns out that it was that I've pieced this together. I don't think that my mom even knows this for sure, but I, based on my love for history and some research that I've done, as far as I can tell, those grandparents were Catholics. They came from Poland during a time when the Jehovah's Witnesses were aggressively evangelizing, if you can call it that, these Catholics coming into Canada, immigrating. They had a very relentless campaign to convert these immigrants into their religion. And so I think about the fact that, and she died as a Jehovah's Witness and had that funeral and whatever. But I think of, who knows now, Robert, like her status,
Mm-hmm,
if you
mm-hmm.
will. But I think about the fact that that my great grandma was a Catholic at one point, and the grace of those people, if they're able to pray for us, right? That's powerful too. Those that came before us. It might skip some generations of those uncatechized people, right? But you yourself have talked about these seeds planted, not by the generation directly above you necessarily, but those our ancestors, the saints throughout time who can pray for us. That's a beautiful thing in the Catholic faith. We believe they have that power, and those prayers, right? I think how I don't know. It's a sacred moment for me, thinking back to finding that rosary in that Bible and going, wow, like that. For all I know, my great grandma could have been praying me into the church when I was on my journey into the Catholic faith, and I never even really knew about it.
See, now you're giving me goosebumps, and as we wind up here too, if you'll just permit me to kind of share a little bit more. So when you're talking about your grandmother like that, one of the prayers I do when I'm praying my rosary, I always end off with a litany of saints, but then I also go through a litany of family members and close friends who have passed away.
Wow.
My father, for example, and I'll share his story in a moment, but I'll say, and I've been slagging my dad, and really I shouldn't, and I'm going to share a wonderful story about him in a second. I'll say, Donald LeBlanc, pray for me as I pray for you. Because like you say, we don't know their status once they leave this earthly life. It's not for us to decide.
Yeah.
It's our hope that they make it to heaven. And so I pray that he's there. And if he's there, I'm asking him to pray for me. Right? And those seeds that are planted, and I always say that the faith is like garlic. When people have asked, my own teenage son included, my child has kind of wandered away from the faith. And first of all, here's a prayer of petition to Saint Monica, because if anyone knows, she knows. But I also say faith is like garlic. You plant garlic in the fall, and it lies dormant through all the dark days of winter. And then in the spring, it finally sprouts forth, and it comes to full bloom in the summer, right? So you can say tulips. Tulips are a little bit more a prettier way of saying it. But when I first came to me, it was like, your faith is like garlic. It can be smelly too, but that's
kills vampires, Robert. So,
yeah. So if you just permit me to finish off, I mean, kind of that hope and that faith. And I said my dad had, he was the one who was raised Catholic, and he had this opportunity to raise us Catholic, and he didn't really put that much effort into it. I don't want to be slagging him through the whole podcast here. So I do want to share a story of my dad on his deathbed, because as an adult, and as I came back into the faith, and Ellie and I, my wife and I, lived our faith, he would mock us at sometimes and kind of tease us about our faith and praying. When he went into palliative care, then we knew it was just a matter of days. I finally asked my mom, and we called the priest to come and give him the anointing of the sick. Right. So the priest is there at his bedside in the nursing home, and he's going through the sacrament and the prayers of the sacrament. And my dad, through his morphine-induced haze to help keep him comfortable in his last moments, you could see he was struggling to follow along the sacrament. He knew at that point in time how important this sacrament was. And you could see him focusing and fighting and struggling to focus on the prayers and the gestures and everything that was going on in the sacrament. And when the sacrament was finally finished, my dad struggled. He managed to lift his head up off the pillow, and the second last word I ever heard him say was, "Amen." Amen. Right? And I think I'm getting goosebumps now sharing it, and it gets easier with time. It's been 4 years. It gets easier to share this story. But that is our hope. And I think of our Lord's parable of the workers in the vineyard, those that start at 9 a.m, right? I maybe started at about 10:30, kind of after the first coffee break as I entered into the faith at 9. You came in maybe at the afternoon coffee break. My dad came in 2 minutes before quitting time. right? And that is our hope. And if there was one faith lesson for him to teach me, that was it, right? So,
Oh, you're killing me.
so
What a way to end. You've got yourself, myself, I don't know, yourself, and all the listeners just
yeah, like I say,
Polarize
it's easier to share that story. The first time I shared that, I barely made it through. But
That's
if there
powerful
was
stuff.
one faith story for my dad to have shared with me growing up Catholic, he waited until
Wow.
the very end, right?
That's incredible. I'm speechless, which is bad for a host of a show. Robert, that is just, I think, the perfect place to end. This has been an absolute treat for me. Listen, I want to thank you for being here on the show, for your friendship. I mean, we started chatting for your podcast, and we've continued since then. And I really appreciate the role you've played of being somebody in my life. Yeah. I mean, we have not met in person yet for that pint, but it's coming. I've moved further away from you, but it's okay. We can meet in the middle still.
Oh, yeah, I think we can meet in the middle, and I think
Yeah.
in the not so distant future, we could end up being closer together eventually. Anyways, I think there's at least one more move in my future.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't it be great?
That would be fantastic. It's been almost a year since you were on the podcast, and we do want to have you on again real soon. This has been an absolute blast. Like you say, from the first moment when we realized we were both from the same hometown, and then those text messages back and forth throughout the year, I feel like we've grown as brothers in the faith. And I've been looking since you sent the invitation, I've been so looking forward to talking to you live voice and just having a good chuckle as we go along, and kind of making fun of my alma mater there, because the Catholic high school that those of us that were there, and I've mentioned it on our podcast as well, that you've talked about this, and I say, and shamefacedly, I was probably one of those guys. Not that I knew where to get all the dough, that wasn't, but yeah, if you wanted a beer, I mean, that's why we're at the Pints and Pews podcast, I guess.
Exactly. Nothing has changed. Well, thank you so much, Robert. I appreciate it. Thank you for I want to say too, thank you for being here, and thank you for this. And I want to say God bless you and the work you're doing for the church, and in your podcast, in your writing. Where can people go to find, I mean, the show, I'll put links to your show, and in the show notes for this show. It's the Pints and Pews podcast. It's everywhere podcasts are found. You've also written a couple of books, and you speak quite often in our neck of the woods, but probably will travel internationally if somebody is willing to lure you out of your smallish town. Where do you want to point people towards to learn more about the ways to connect with you?
The easiest place to find all of those things is catholicmoment.ca. So I had started a YouTube ministry a few years ago, Catholic Moment, like short 5-7 minute videos just going through the Catholic faith. Time restraints have kind of put that on the back burner of late. But no, Catholic Moment, you can find there links to the videos that were there. You can find there a link to the podcast as well. You can find a link to describe the two books. So the first one that came out, both of them are with Justin Press, which is out of Ottawa, great small Canadian Catholic publisher. Who do you say that I am, and other questions that Christ asks us? So look at 8 different questions that Jesus poses in the Gospels, and what does that mean for us living in the world today? And then the one that came out last year, 5 Smooth Stones, facing the Goliaths of our fears, looking at the story of David and Goliath, and how David put 5 smooth stones into his shepherd's pouch to take on Goliath, and what do we need to do to take on the Goliaths of our fears out in the world today? So you can find that there. The different talks that I do, drop me a line through that. That's really the easiest, catholicmoment.ca.
Awesome. I'll put the link to that in the show notes as well. Robert, thank you. Thanks for your work. Thanks for being here. This has been a blast. I appreciate it. Hopefully listeners love it. I think it was great. I'm biased because I think you're a cool guy, but we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see what they think.
I'm a band geek, so yeah, I wouldn't go that far. So
The French horn. That's the best. Thanks, Robert. Take care. God bless you. And thanks for being here this week.
well, thank you, and God bless you as well, Keith.